My girlfriend, Emily, had a knack for baking. Her culinary creations weren't Michelin star quality, but they were always infused with a generous measure of love and creativity. Every Halloween, she transformed our cozy kitchen into a makeshift bakery, a place where sweet dreams took shape in the form of ghost-shaped cookies, pumpkin cupcakes, and gooey caramel apples. Our neighborhood had come to eagerly anticipate Emily's Halloween treats year after year. It was during this time that a new family moved in next door, the Johnsons. They were the talk of the town, thanks to their peculiar dietary preferences. It seemed that Mrs. Johnson was adamant about her children adhering to a strict, almost ascetic, diet, low sugar, low carbs, and a ban on anything remotely enjoyable. She even had the audacity to ask Emily to replace sugar with manuka honey and to sneak vegetables into the treats. And, to make matters even more baffling, she refused to chip in for the extra cost, convinced that her children were the only ones deserving of such special treatment. It was, to put it mildly, an eccentric request that left us both flabbergasted. The day of Halloween arrived, and our home was filled with the sweet scent of freshly baked goodies. Emily was in her element, sporting an apron adorned with tiny witches riding broomsticks and dancing black cats. The haunting melodies of The Nightmare Before Christmas provided the soundtrack to her culinary adventure. With meticulous care, she shaped cookies into eerie witch fingers, complete with almond slice nails. Pumpkins with smiling faces emerged from the oven, and caramel bubbled away on the stove. The treats were anything but low sugar or low carb. They were a celebration of all things sweet, whimsical, and delicious. As darkness fell, the doorbell began to chime, signaling the start of the neighborhood's annual trick-or-treat parade. Emily, with a warm smile and a twinkle in her eye, welcomed each group of costumed children and their parents. Then came the moment we'd all been anticipating, the Johnsons' arrival. Emily handed each of their children a small bag filled not with the expected treats, but with neatly arranged carrot sticks. However, there was a clever twist. Inside those bags were handwritten notes that read something like, "These should match all of your dietary requests, Mrs. Johnson. Hope they find them as delightful as we do. In case anything changes, there are extra cookies filled with sugar and numbers. I'll be happy to share." About 15 minutes later, the Johnson kids returned to our doorstep, this time with their father in tow. I didn't personally witness the conversation that transpired, as I respected Emily's reign as the designated candy distributor. However, I do know that they shared a hearty laugh together. The children's faces, once a picture of reluctant obedience, now bore traces of sticky sweetness, and the dad left with a handful of sugary, flavorful cookies tucked away in his pockets. It was a Halloween night that we would cherish for years to come, a night when Emily's baking talent triumphed over dietary eccentricities and where, for a brief moment, sweet revenge was served on a plate of delectable cookies.
I'm a 26-year-old woman living in a rented house with a single mother, Lisa, 30 years old, and her 6-year-old son, Max. The living arrangement came about after my previous roommate moved out, and Lisa and Max moved in. Initially, I had no issues with cohabiting with them. We mostly went about our own lives. I often spent time in my boyfriend's place or was engrossed in work. Our schedules rarely aligned, so there was minimal interaction, which suited us all just fine. However, a concern gradually crept into my life, one that revolved around food. Financial struggles were evident in Lisa's life, but I didn't see it as an excuse for certain behaviors. I wasn't swimming in riches either, but respecting personal boundaries remained a priority. Over time, I began noticing that my food was mysteriously disappearing or portions were vanishing. Initially, I suspected Max, and I decided to address it with Lisa in a calm manner. She assured me that she would keep an eye on her son's food habits. At first, this didn't bother me much. But as it continued, the annoyance grew. Returning home from work, hungry and anticipating leftovers in the fridge, only to find them devoured, was disheartening. I kept bringing up the issue, but Lisa seemed increasingly irritated by my inquiries. Through careful observation, I noticed a common pattern: they both avoided vegetables like the plague. The untouched broccoli on the plate told the tale. So, I devised a plan to make vegetables a central element in every dish I prepared. Personally, I enjoyed vegetables immensely, and I found their aversion perplexing. Bell peppers found their way into practically everything I cooked. Even if I had leftovers like mashed potatoes or cheesy fries, I'd incorporate green beans or broccoli to satiate my vegetable cravings. Naturally, my homemade creations had vegetables as a staple, but I was taking it a step further. One day, when I prepared Max's favorite dish, mac and cheese, I threw in some roasted Brussels sprouts, a combination I found delicious. Lisa was in the living room when she noticed the addition and asked, "What are you going to do with that?" My response was simple: I like Brussels sprouts. Her reaction was less than favorable. She accused me of being greedy and annoying, to which I replied, "Well, I enjoy Brussels sprouts." When she mentioned they needed food, I suggested she go purchase some groceries or diversify their food choices beyond prepackaged items to make her budget stretch further. Lisa seems to view my actions as an act of revenge, but my intent is straightforward. I want to be able to enjoy my food without the constant disappearance. Sharing isn't the issue, it's the expectation of having food available and it's suddenly vanishing that's unsettling. Often, I'd return home from a long day, hungry and ready to have a meal, only to find everything gone. It's disheartening to wake up in a rush, your breakfast ready to go, and then discover it's been devoured. She could easily send a text asking if it's okay to consume a particular food item, and I'd understand and adjust my plans accordingly. Eating someone else's food, especially the last portion without permission, strikes me as inconsiderate and rude.
I was hired at an organization in a position that was essentially a helper. Despite the job title, I found myself buried under an overwhelming workload. Most of my coworkers were not particularly tech-savvy, and I, on the other hand, was quite comfortable with technology. This allowed me to become a valuable asset to the team. For instance, one of my colleagues spent an astonishing amount of time manually copying and transferring items to another program. Instead of using the simple Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V shortcut, he opted for a cumbersome right-click, copy, and paste approach. He proudly showed me his method, assuring me that I wouldn't have to retype everything. Without his knowledge, I took it upon myself to write a program that automated this task, saving us precious hours. I kept running the program discreetly as part of my responsibilities. I took on several such tasks, estimating that I saved about 15 hours of work every day in addition to my 8.5-hour workday. But then came Sergeant Douglas, as I like to call him, though this wasn't a military setting. One day, Sergeant Douglas showed up at our team meeting. He had white hair, a somewhat disheveled appearance, and glasses. He had seemingly appeared out of nowhere, quietly taking notes during our morning meetings. During one meeting, someone mentioned the name of one of our customers, and I jokingly asked, "Is that the 300-pound guy with a big beard?" It was meant in jest, as I was primarily involved in back-end tasks. I had recently dealt with someone who fit that description while assisting with an entry process. However, my boss corrected me, stating that it was a different customer. We then discussed that customer for a bit. About a week later, I noticed that Sergeant Douglas had turned hostile towards me. It was perplexing and unwarranted. He would ignore me during group discussions and occasionally even scoff at me. Who scoffs at people, I wondered. I was going through a particularly challenging week, searching for critical files while being bombarded with constant yelling and demands. Anxiety attacks were becoming a nightly ordeal, and I was exhausted. But it was Friday, and I was determined to push through. In the midst of my search, I ventured deep into our file structure, only to stumble upon a personal folder within one of the drives labeled Sergeant Douglas's Notes. Out of curiosity, I clicked it, and what I found was beyond belief. It appeared that Sergeant Douglas traveled from one location to another, orchestrating firings to save the CEO money. I scrolled through his notes, and at the very top was an entry that read, "Frosty thought a 4 feet 10 inches, 24-year-old female colleague was a 300 pounds bearded man." Clearly, atrocious attention to detail. This was just one example of the derogatory comments he had made. Fueled by this discovery, the frustration of an underpaid job, a grueling week, and Sergeant Douglas's comments, I had had enough. I hatched a plan. I set up 3 email configurations, one to my boss, informing him that I would be taking 2 weeks of vacation starting at 10 p.m. that night. Another to the company, notifying them that I would be absent for 2 weeks, and any pending work would need to be handled by them. The email was scheduled to be sent at 4 a.m. on Monday morning. For any incoming emails, I set an auto-response stating, "I will be out for an unknown amount of time." For any routine, emergency, or occasional matters, please contact Sergeant Douglas at email address for assistance. Additionally, I deactivated all the automated tasks I had ever set up. I dropped by Sergeant Douglas's temporary office and offered, "I think I found a way to make your job easier." He barely acknowledged my presence, raising an eyebrow without looking at me. I left his office with a sense of satisfaction. I received several calls on Monday morning, all of which I chose not to answer. It didn't take long for things to unravel, but I remained resolute, refusing to respond to anything. By Wednesday, I had moments of anxiety, but I persevered. I thought about the tasks that required a 2-day turnaround. I was certain that at least 2 people had been pulled from their regular duties just to keep up with the automated tasks. Then, on Thursday night of the first week, I received a lengthy email from my boss at my personal account, probably from my resume or interview. "Frosty, I understand you're a smart person and have likely figured out what's been going on at the company. Calling you may not work, I see that now. I've spoken to Sergeant Douglas's superior, and he will no longer be at our location." I explained that our progress meetings were heading in the wrong direction, and that you are one of the most valuable employees here. "I'm sure you're looking at other job options or may have even started one." "I hope not. If you could please get in touch with me, I'd like to offer you a substantial raise. Your value to the company has become exceedingly clear. I hear praises about your contributions every day." I returned to work on Monday, with a $10,000 raise and Sergeant Douglas out of my way. My boss apologized in person once more and mentioned that he didn't have a say before I left, but it had changed after my absence. It was a bit peculiar, but I understood the underlying dynamics.
There's a specific wine I like to pair with food, and the nearest store that carried it was a 60-mile drive away. This was during the holiday season, and since I anticipated being cooped up indoors, I decided to make the trek. This particular store used to be my go-to Total Wine until I moved 2 counties away. Nevertheless, I made the journey, picking up the wine and some other holiday essentials. I spent about an hour shopping, and when it came time to check out, things took an unexpected turn. The cashier asked for my ID, which was a standard request. I handed it over without thinking much of it. However, she then told me she needed to see the ID of the person I was supposedly with. I was taken aback and clarified that I was alone. In response, she informed me that she needed to fetch her manager. The manager arrived, and I explained the situation to him, reiterating that I had come to the store alone. To my disbelief, he stated, "Unfortunately, you look young." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. At this point, my frustration was growing. I wondered, "Are you serious?" He then suggested that I return the next day, alone. I found this treatment disrespectful, especially considering that I had been a loyal customer at that location for about 4 years, never encountering such an issue before. The next day, I visited another Total Wine close to my home to purchase the remaining items I needed. Unfortunately, they were out of the wine I initially wanted, which is why I hadn't gone there in the first place. However, the staff at this location were pleasant as usual and didn't even ask for my ID, highlighting the stark contrast between the two stores. It seemed like the other location was on some kind of power trip. Shortly afterward, I received an email asking me to review my recent experience at Total Wine, a request I usually ignored. But this time, I decided to share my feedback, specifically about the problematic location. I described the events exactly as they had occurred, and the next day, I received a call from the store manager. It turned out that the person who had refused to sell me the wine that night was an assistant manager or something similar. However, my conversation with the woman who called me was far from pleasant. She was rude and condescending, insisting that the store had reviewed the security footage and seen someone walk in with me at the same time, which they deemed constituted a party. I vehemently denied knowing the person and questioned the logic of such a policy. She argued that it didn't matter, and people couldn't walk into Total Wine at the same time as you. I found this utterly absurd and couldn't believe they hadn't communicated this policy when they saw the person leave the store earlier. I told her that even if that was the case, at the very least, they could have apologized for the inconvenience. Instead, she had called me to argue, adding insult to injury. Her attitude and unpleasantness left me even more frustrated. I decided to investigate their policies and discovered that this rule applied only to parties at checkout, which was far more reasonable. Feeling frustrated and slightly inebriated one day, I decided to enforce their own policy against them. I made a massive $10,000 order for the earliest possible pickup time, knowing that they promised orders ready within 3 hours. I ensured that I ordered the cheapest but heaviest bottles I could think of, maximizing the space it would occupy in their curbside pickup area. I ordered only 1 or 2 of each item so that they couldn't just hand me a case, they had to fetch individual bottles. Additionally, I bought their entire stock of Tito's vodka, a popular item during the holidays. Their curbside pickup area was located at the front of the store, visible to customers. I knew that seeing the chaos I had created would prompt questions, and it would certainly put their employees and managers on edge. 5 hours later, I received the pickup confirmation email, a little later than expected. Subsequently, I received a pickup reminder, a second reminder 3 days later, and a final notice after 7 days. On the 10th day, I received a call from the manager, a complete shift from her previous demeanor. She inquired when I would be picking up the order. By this point, I was fairly certain she suspected that I was messing with them, considering the 10-day delay and the fact that she knew my name from the previous feedback I had provided. I calmly responded, "Yeah, I tried to pick it up, but I was told I looked too young, so I went to the other Total Wine and got the same stuff there." Her anger was evident, and she exclaimed, "Are you seriously not coming to pick this up?" I replied with a casual, "Nah." She hung up, and I couldn't help but chuckle. If their higher-ups ever questioned why their store had to issue a $10,000 refund, they'd certainly have an interesting story to tell. The order was supposed to be canceled automatically after 7 days, but it appeared that the manager had been holding out, probably to end the year on a better financial note. Retail, after all, has its quirks. I ultimately called their customer service line to cancel the order, which they reluctantly did. I once had a relationship that was far from healthy. Unfortunately, my girlfriend was unfaithful, and the discovery of her infidelity led to a tumultuous period in my life. The person she was involved with had been manipulated into not speaking to me and even resorted to threatening me with violence. In the end, we decided to part ways. She moved out of our shared home and into his place, while I embarked on a journey towards self-improvement, which included seeking therapy to heal my emotional wounds. Several months into therapy, I realized that my turmoil was not solely rooted in the failed relationship with my ex-girlfriend. It was a culmination of various aspects of my life that needed change. I decided to make a fresh start, pursuing a new job and a new place to live. As fate would have it, on the day I received a job offer for my new position, an email popped up in our company's jobs ad inbox. To my surprise, the sender was the same person who had once threatened me, now living with my former girlfriend. In an unexpected turn of events, I decided to refer him to my soon-to-be ex-employer, highlighting his positive qualities and making a convincing case for his hire. During his interview, I found myself on the panel, and when we were left alone for a moment, he took the opportunity to apologize for his previous actions and expressed his gratitude for my assistance. I responded with a measure of understanding, acknowledging that my ex-girlfriend had spoken highly of him, and we shared a polite, albeit somewhat awkward, chuckle. To my surprise, he performed reasonably well in the interview and secured the job. Little did I know that this job would turn out to be a nightmare, the most unpleasant I had ever experienced. My decision to leave that position behind for a new opportunity felt like a breath of fresh air, as I was headed towards a place that offered better pay for less workload. Meanwhile, my friend from my former workplace, who had moved into my previous apartment, was facing similar challenges. The apartment, which had initially seemed charming, revealed its true colors: constant issues with maintenance, and a landlord who was slow to respond to requests. My old job was taking its toll on him as well, with long hours, unrealistic expectations, and a high-stress environment. As we compared notes, it became clear that our respective decisions to step into each other's shoes had not led to the happiness we had initially hoped for. It seemed that our shared experiences went beyond the workplace and apartment and extended into the complicated relationship with my ex-girlfriend. It was a stark reminder that sometimes, the grass is not always greener on the other side. I hope his experience in that chapter of my life was more enjoyable than mine, although I have my doubts. What I do know is that their relationship came to an end about 2 months later, leaving all of us with valuable lessons learned.
Living with my roommate, who is a single mother about a decade older than me, has been an interesting roller coaster ride over the past year. She has an adorable 8-year-old daughter who affectionately calls me her BFF and often surprises me with her sweet drawings. However, my roommate herself, unfortunately, doesn't quite fall into the category of great person. From the very day I moved in, our interactions have been limited to one-sided avoidance. She never says hello or engages in small talk, creating a palpable awkwardness within our shared living space. The contrast is stark because her daughter, who is quite the chatterbox, is always eager to connect with me. One of the most glaring issues is her neglect of household responsibilities. Dirty dishes accumulate in the sink for weeks on end, and leftovers sit out, tempting fate and pests. The garbage bin becomes a breeding ground for maggots whenever I'm away for a few days, a sight that never fails to greet me upon my return. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of our living situation is how she treats her daughter. Frequent yelling echoes through the apartment, creating an unsettling atmosphere. The young girl sleeps on a simple mattress on the floor without a designated bedtime, often resulting in her tardiness for school. Instead of ensuring her daughter makes it to school on time, my roommate encourages her to feign illness and stay quietly in her room, just to avoid the school run. It's a practice she sometimes employs when she has long work shifts, leaving her child home alone for extended periods. I've arrived home to find the young girl bored and hungry, forcing me into the role of surrogate caregiver. Their financial struggles are evident, they can't even afford a proper bed or do their laundry. Yet, somehow, my roommate manages to acquire expensive luxuries like new Jordan sneakers and high-end face creams. It's a baffling contrast that leaves me feeling profoundly sympathetic toward the child caught in this turbulent environment. Although I've contemplated contacting Child Protective Services, I fear that it might only exacerbate their already precarious situation. Now, on to the never-ending saga of the shared bathroom. Our four-person household shares a single washroom, and my roommate makes it her laundry center. She spends up to an hour hand-washing her clothes, leaving the bathroom unavailable for the rest of us. Even more infuriatingly, she hangs her clothes from the shower rod to dry, much like her dishes, leaving them there for weeks on end. She casually suggests that I move her clothes when I need to shower, a task I've begrudgingly taken up. But my patience has worn thin, and I've resorted to taking showers with her clothes still hanging there, leaving them drenched. At this point, I've reached a point where I don't even care anymore, and I'm considering bringing a spray bottle to further wet her clothes each time I enter the washroom. In my quest for petty retaliation, I've also resorted to racing to the bathroom as soon as I enter the apartment. Strangely, the mere sound of me opening a door, be it the front door or my bedroom door, seems to trigger a rush to the washroom on their part. It's as if they have an uncontrollable urge to get there before me, despite having spent hours in their room without coming out. This peculiar bathroom race has become an odd yet strangely satisfying source of amusement in an otherwise challenging living situation.
In the backdrop of my parents' divorce, a complex story unfolds. Following the separation, my mother, a once devoted stay-at-home mom, chose to live with my grandfather. She embraced the role of caregiver, finding solace in taking care of him while he reveled in her company and culinary talents, a mutually beneficial arrangement. But the situation was far from harmonious, largely due to Clara, my father's new partner, who harbored qualities that grated on me. Chief among them was her penchant for gossiping behind people's backs, a habit that drew my ire. I often overheard her disparaging unknown individuals, my sisters, and even myself. Equally infuriating was her blatant disregard for personal boundaries. Whenever her child grew bored, she allowed him to enter my home and use my PlayStation and games without my consent or my father's presence. Clara vehemently denied these actions, but I knew better. One day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. Before leaving the house for a few hours, I left my PC's webcam recording, catching Clara red-handed. To my astonishment, not only was she letting her true colors show regarding her backbiting tendencies, but she was also deriding her boss, my father's friend, whom my dad had helped secure a job at his restaurant. She disparaged him, claiming she could manage the restaurant far better. Armed with evidence, I bided my time, awaiting the perfect moment to confront her and reveal the damning video to my father. The opportune moment arrived one evening when I heard Clara uttering a cruel remark about my mother. She insinuated that real women have jobs, unlike that useless walrus of your ex-wife. My anger surged, and I stormed into the room, unleashing a vociferous argument. As expected, Clara defaulted to her victim persona. I, however, was unyielding. I declared, "Your mouth might have won you favor with my dad, but I won't tolerate you disrespecting my mom. You will apologize now, or there will be consequences." Unsurprisingly, Clara neither apologized nor showed remorse. Instead, she laughed mockingly. The following weekend, I wasted no time. Armed with a freshly burned CD containing Clara's incriminating video, I marched into the restaurant. I inquired about Lou, my father's childhood friend and the subject of Clara's vitriol. They had known each other for years, and Lou was no fan of Clara either, given his familiarity with my mother. When I showed Lou the video, his anger was palpable. He expressed his condolences for my father's predicament and thanked me for exposing Clara's true character. Come Monday, Clara was dismissed from her job. Confronting her once more, I couldn't resist a final taunt. "So, how does it feel not to be a real woman now?" I chuckled and walked away, leaving Clara fuming in my wake, just as she often left me. It wasn't long before Clara's reputation took a nosedive. Her abrupt departure from the restaurant, paired with the scandalous video revelation, left her with few allies in the close-knit community. Her once boisterous presence at neighborhood gatherings dwindled, and her name was met with hushed conversations and sidelong glances. As for me, I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication, knowing that my efforts had uncovered Clara's true colors and put an end to her toxic influence on my father's life. Still, a lingering sense of discomfort remained, as our home, once filled with tension, now carried the weight of a different kind of unease, the aftermath of a confrontation that had irrevocably altered our family dynamics. Over time, my father distanced himself from Clara, acknowledging the toxicity that had taken root in their relationship. The dissolution of their partnership led to a period of introspection, during which my father reconnected with my mother, recognizing the value of the woman who had dedicated her life to our family, even in the face of divorce. As for Clara, she moved on, her reputation in tatters. The incident served as a harsh lesson in the consequences of her actions, prompting her to reflect on her own behavior and the need for personal growth. In the end, the confrontation and its fallout had a profound impact on all parties involved. It was a stark reminder that actions have consequences, and that sometimes, it takes a brave soul to stand up against injustice, even within the confines of one's own family.
Lisa had reached the end of her patience. For months, she had endured the antics of her roommate, Sarah, who seemed to view the kitchen as a war zone rather than a place of culinary creativity. Pots and pans lay in haphazard piles, dirty dishes piled up in the sink like an ever-growing tower, and the refrigerator bore witness to a chaotic mix of expired food containers. Fed up with the relentless mess and the lack of consideration for shared spaces, Lisa decided to take matters into her own hands. She wasn't the confrontational type, so she opted for a more passive-aggressive approach. One evening, while Sarah was out with friends, Lisa seized the opportunity to initiate her culinary revenge. Sarah had been boasting about her famous spaghetti sauce for weeks, and Lisa knew that it was her roommate's pride and joy. Lisa decided to tamper with this cherished recipe. She began by discreetly relocating the key ingredients. The ground beef? Substituted with tofu. The secret blend of spices? Replaced with a concoction of cinnamon, nutmeg, and a hint of paprika. And the tomatoes? Well, Lisa conveniently forgot to buy them. The next day, as Sarah enthusiastically prepared to whip up her signature dish, she discovered the missing ingredients. Panic set in, but Lisa pretended to be oblivious. "Oh, I thought you had everything you needed," she innocently remarked. With determination, Sarah decided to make do with what she had on hand. The meal that emerged from her efforts was a far cry from her usual masterpiece. As she served it to her friends, their puzzled expressions spoke volumes. Lisa couldn't help but stifle a grin. But Lisa's culinary sabotage was just beginning. She continued to discreetly swap ingredients in other dishes, making Sarah's meals progressively more peculiar. Vanilla extract found its way into the chili, and hot sauce replaced the maple syrup in the pancake batter. Soon, Sarah's once confident culinary prowess began to crumble. Her friends grew wary of her offerings, and her reputation as the kitchen magician began to tarnish. Lisa watched with glee as Sarah's once thriving social dinners turned into awkward affairs. As the chaos in the kitchen escalated, Lisa also decided to tackle the issue of the perpetually disorganized space. One day, when Sarah was out, Lisa embarked on a secret mission to reorganize the kitchen. She labeled shelves, sorted utensils, and arranged spices alphabetically. When Sarah returned, she couldn't find anything in her own kitchen. Frustrated and defeated, Sarah finally confronted Lisa. "What have you done to my kitchen?" she demanded. With an innocent smile, Lisa replied, "I thought we could use a little organization. And as for your recipes, maybe it's time for a change." Sarah was baffled, unable to pinpoint exactly what Lisa had done. But she couldn't deny the improvement in kitchen cleanliness. Slowly but surely, Sarah began to adapt to the newly organized space. Over time, Lisa's culinary comeuppance strategy had the desired effect. Sarah's chaotic cooking and inconsiderate kitchen habits gradually improved. With each incident, she became more conscious of the importance of shared spaces and the need for consideration. As for Lisa, she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as she watched the transformation unfold. She had achieved her goal of teaching her roommate a valuable lesson, one that didn't require direct confrontation but had humorous consequences. The roommate's culinary comeuppance had succeeded in creating a cleaner, more harmonious living environment, and it was a testament to the power of creative and passive-aggressive problem-solving.
Leo was a creature of habit. He relished the simplicity of his bachelor life, where technology was his closest companion, and microwave dinners his culinary forte. He lived in a cozy one-bedroom apartment, conveniently located within walking distance of his office, which suited his introverted nature just fine. His daily routine was a well-oiled machine: work, return home, fire up his computer, lose himself in video games, and then reheat a frozen meal for dinner. But all that was about to change, thanks to an unexpected neighborly request. Mrs. Henderson, Leo's elderly neighbor in the apartment next door, had always been a kind and sweet lady. They exchanged pleasantries in the hallway and sometimes chatted when they bumped into each other near the mailboxes. Leo admired her tenacity and spunk, especially for someone in her late 70s. One sunny Saturday morning, as Leo was engrossed in fixing a particularly stubborn bug in his software, his doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Henderson, her arthritic hands clutching a handwritten note. Leo opened the door, not knowing that this encounter would unravel the comfortable cocoon he had carefully crafted for himself. "Good morning, Leo dear," Mrs. Henderson greeted with a warm smile. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Leo, caught off guard but ever the polite neighbor, invited her in. "Not at all, Mrs. Henderson. What can I do for you?" She handed him the note, her handwriting shaky but legible. It was a simple request for help with cooking, as her arthritis had worsened, making it increasingly difficult for her to prepare meals. She explained that her family lived far away, and she didn't want to be a burden. Leo scanned the note, feeling a mixture of surprise and obligation. He'd never been much of a cook, but he couldn't refuse Mrs. Henderson's heartfelt plea. Reluctantly, he agreed to lend a hand, suggesting that they start with something easy. The first lesson was scrambled eggs. As Leo stood in Mrs. Henderson's tidy kitchen, he watched her instruct him on the art of whisking eggs and seasoning them just right. It was simpler than he had imagined, and he couldn't help but chuckle at his own initial apprehension. Over the following weeks, Leo and Mrs. Henderson embarked on a culinary journey together. She introduced him to a world of flavors, teaching him to make hearty soups, fluffy pancakes, and comforting casseroles. Leo discovered that he had a knack for following recipes and that cooking wasn't as daunting as he'd once believed. What started as a reluctant obligation gradually transformed into a shared passion. Leo found himself looking forward to their cooking sessions, their conversations flowing as smoothly as the ingredients they combined. They swapped stories about their lives, shared their dreams, and exchanged tidbits of wisdom. One evening, while savoring a homemade lasagna they prepared together, Mrs. Henderson confided, "Leo, you've become my lifeline. I was lonely before, but now, spending time with you, I feel young again." Leo felt a warmth in his heart that was entirely new to him. He realized that his rigid routines and digital companions had isolated him from the richness of human connection. With Mrs. Henderson, he'd found a friend, a mentor, and a newfound love for cooking. As the months passed, Leo continued to assist Mrs. Henderson, but their roles had shifted. He had transformed from the reluctant chef into a willing companion who cherished the time spent in her company. Their bond had blossomed, creating a vibrant friendship that enriched both of their lives. The day finally came when Mrs. Henderson's family visited, marveling at the transformation in her demeanor. They thanked Leo profusely for his kindness, unaware of the profound impact their elderly neighbor had had on his life as well. With Mrs. Henderson's health gradually improving and her family's support increasing, Leo resumed his previous routines, but he carried with him the cherished memories of their culinary adventures and the reminder that life could offer delightful surprises, even when you least expect them. Leo's once reluctant heart had been opened by a simple note and a neighbor in need, teaching him that sometimes, the most beautiful connections are formed in the unlikeliest of places.
In the early 2010s, during my mid-20s, I embarked on a quest for a used moped. My search led me to an online marketplace, where I stumbled upon a seemingly promising deal. However, What ensued was a bizarre and petty feud that I couldn't have foreseen. The seller, for some peculiar reason, refused to meet at his location. Instead, he agreed to meet at my sprawling apartment complex, which provided a level of anonymity since he wouldn't know my specific unit. Arriving with the moped in the back of his truck, the situation took a nosedive as 2 to 3 pieces literally fell off the vehicle. To make matters worse, the moped had a flat tire, rendering it impossible to test ride. At that point, I was utterly disinterested. In response to my decision to walk away from the deal, the seller's demeanor took a drastic turn. He began yelling, hurling accusations that I was wasting his time and demanding compensation for the gas he had spent. I didn't hold back in delivering a piece of my mind before departing, which should have been the end of our bizarre encounter. However, he refused to let it go and continued to bombard me with calls and text messages filled with derogatory language. What began as a juvenile exchange soon spiraled into a vulgar war of words. Most of his insults centered around my supposed homosexuality, despite my clear declaration of being straight and the presence of my girlfriend with me during our meeting. With a blend of immaturity and depravity akin to South Park dialogue, I decided to play along, retaliating with equally tasteless remarks about his mother. After an especially brutal exchange, he suddenly ceased contact, and I hoped the ordeal was over. Little did I know that it was just the calm before the storm. The following day, my phone erupted with incessant calls and text messages, rendering it practically unusable. I was drowning in multiple missed calls, voicemails, and unsolicited explicit images. It took me a while to decipher the chaos, but I discovered that the seller had posted numerous Craigslist ads all across the country. These ads ranged from unbelievable deals on vehicles and apartments to casual encounters, all using my contact information. Frustration and embarrassment reached their peak. I had no choice but to borrow my girlfriend's phone to file a police report. After some time, the police officer mediated a conversation between us, resembling a stern teacher reprimanding misbehaving children. We both agreed to cease the harassment, and I thought the nightmare had come to an end. But it wasn't over. Several months later, the torment resurfaced, and I once again contacted the police. This time, they were less helpful, questioning if I could prove the culprit's identity. Frustrated and left with few options, I requested a copy of the police report, hoping to pursue legal action. Much to my luck, the police report included an address, a glaring oversight on their part. With newfound ammunition in hand, I hatched a brilliant plan. On a Friday night, I created a slew of fake Craigslist ads from a burner account. The ads offered an array of household items, bikes, kids' stuff, clothes, furniture, appliances, and more, all for free. The fabricated story explained that I was moving abroad and needed everything gone urgently. I provided the seller's address and indicated that the items would be placed on the driveway at 5:30 a.m. the next morning. Eager to witness the spectacle unfold, I parked my car a block away from his residence at precisely 5 a.m., removing the ads to cover my tracks. Then, I simply waited for the chaos to begin. Saturday morning arrived, and it was as if Black Friday had collided with a garage sale frenzy on steroids. A sea of vehicles descended upon his neighborhood. Pickup trucks, trailers, box trucks, and regular cars formed a gridlock that extended several blocks. The cacophony of honking resembled rush-hour traffic. His lawn was transformed into a bustling bazaar, and the scene looked more like a concert than a neighborhood. Amidst the bedlam, I could hear him and his girlfriend losing their minds. Neighbors were shouting from their windows, and I couldn't help but chuckle at the pandemonium I had orchestrated. Surprisingly, I never faced any retaliation. It seemed my message had finally hit home, teaching him a lesson about the consequences of tormenting the wrong person. He had gotten the better of me initially, but in the end, the tables had turned, and I had the last laugh.
Once upon a time, in a quaint suburban neighborhood, the countdown to Halloween had begun. Excitement buzzed through the air as children of all ages eagerly anticipated the spookiest night of the year. However, in one particular household, the approaching holiday filled young Timmy's heart with dread. Timmy was a gentle and imaginative boy, often lost in the pages of adventure novels and the worlds of his own creation. Despite his kind nature, he was an easy target for a group of older kids who enjoyed nothing more than teasing and frightening him. They would hide behind bushes, jump out in gruesome costumes, and generally make Timmy's life miserable. One fateful evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the bullies struck again. Dressed as horrifying monsters, they leaped from the shadows, scaring Timmy to the point of tears. It was the last straw for Timmy's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson. Watching their son's spirit slowly erode under the constant torment, the Thompsons decided it was time to turn the tables. They hatched a cunning plan that would give those tormentors a taste of their own medicine. Halloween would be the perfect night for revenge. As the ominous date approached, the Thompsons meticulously prepared their retaliation. They enlisted the help of friends in neighboring houses, each assigned a specific role in their elaborate scheme. On the big night, Timmy's parents transformed their house into a haunted mansion, complete with eerie decorations, fog machines, and spine-tingling sound effects. The bullies, full of bravado as always, descended upon Timmy's neighborhood, unaware of the chilling surprise awaiting them. As they approached the Thompsons' house, they couldn't help but notice the eerie ambience. Cobwebs adorned the trees, and eerie music wafted through the air. With their hearts pounding, the bullies ventured closer. It wasn't long before they encountered a ghostly figure drifting toward them, moaning and groaning. Petrified, they stumbled backward, right into the path of a skeletal apparition that sprung up from the ground. Screams pierced the night as the bullies darted in every direction, frantically trying to escape the horrors that lurked around every corner. Zombies lurched from the shadows, monstrous creatures leaped from behind gravestones, and eerie voices whispered their names in haunting tones. The bullies were well and truly terrified, their brave facades shattered by the relentless onslaught of scares. Panic-stricken and humiliated, they eventually retreated in disarray, fleeing from the once friendly neighborhood that had become a nightmarish labyrinth. The Thompsons watched their tormentors vanish into the distance, satisfied that justice had been served. Timmy, who had been secretly observing the entire spectacle, couldn't contain his gleeful laughter. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of victory and empowerment. However, the tale didn't end there. The parents of the bullies, infuriated by the fright their children had endured, decided to confront the Thompsons. They marched to their house, their faces contorted with anger, ready to demand an apology. But when they arrived at the haunted mansion, they were met with an unexpected sight. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, still dressed in their eerie costumes, welcomed them with chillingly polite smiles. The very same decorations, fog, and eerie music that had terrified their children now enveloped the Thompsons' home. Frozen in their tracks, the bullies' parents couldn't muster a word. The Thompsons maintained their eerie personas, greeting them with ghostly gestures and whispered threats. Overwhelmed by the bizarre spectacle and unable to comprehend the eerie transformation, the bullies' parents turned and fled, defeated. From that Halloween night onward, the bullies never dared to torment Timmy again. And as for Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, their reputation as the masters of Halloween revenge became the stuff of legend in their neighborhood, ensuring that no one would ever mess with their son or their holiday celebrations again.
In the quaint town of Willowbrook, Halloween was a cherished tradition that brought smiles to children's faces and filled their bags with sugary treasures. But this delightful holiday held a different meaning for two young boys, Andy and Brock. For years, Andy had made it his mischievous mission to steal candies from Brock's Halloween stash. Every year, like clockwork, Andy would sneak into Brock's house and pilfer his precious loot. Brock, a kind-hearted boy who had had enough of Andy's thievery, decided it was time to turn the tables. With the Halloween of revenge drawing near, Brock hatched a clever plan. He meticulously removed all the candies from their wrappers, replacing them with spicy treats that would set Andy's mouth on fire. He chuckled to himself, imagining Andy's bewildered reaction when he bit into the deceptively innocent-looking candies. As Halloween night arrived, the moon cast an eerie glow on the town streets. Brock's house stood ready, with a bowl of fiery candies placed prominently on the porch. Brock donned a costume and waited in the shadows, anticipation coursing through his veins. Andy, driven by his irresistible urge for ill-gotten treats, soon approached Brock's house. He stealthily crept up the porch steps, his hand darting into the candy bowl. With a greedy grin, he grabbed a handful and popped them into his mouth. Seconds later, Andy's triumphant smile twisted into a grimace of pain. Tears welled up in his eyes as the fiery spice overwhelmed his senses. His cries of distress echoed through the night as he desperately tried to extinguish the burning sensation. Brock couldn't help but chuckle at Andy's expense, emerging from the shadows with a smug grin. "Had enough, Andy?" he taunted. Andy, still struggling to recover from the fiery prank, could only nod weakly. In that moment, he realized the consequences of his annual candy thievery. With a heavy heart and watery eyes, he finally apologized to Brock, promising never to steal his candies again. Brock, satisfied that his revenge had finally put an end to the candy thefts, accepted Andy's apology. However, he wasn't quite finished. He had one last trick up his sleeve. In the days that followed, Brock quietly informed the entire town about Andy's wrongdoings. He didn't seek revenge, instead, he let the truth be known. As a result, when Halloween came around the following year, the town had united to teach Andy a lesson. Andy, expecting his usual bounty of candies, went from house to house, receiving far less than he had hoped for. The townsfolk had decided to withhold their sweets, giving him only a small amount as a token of goodwill. Andy's bag grew lighter with each doorstep he visited. Andy watched in dismay as his ill-gotten candy empire crumbled before his eyes. The townspeople had joined forces to put an end to his yearly thefts, ensuring he received only a fraction of what he used to. In the end, Brock's clever revenge had not only saved his Halloween candies, but also taught Andy a valuable lesson about honesty and consequences. From that day forward, Andy learned that tricks and thefts would lead to nothing but a fiery taste of his own medicine, and that the sweetness of Halloween was meant to be enjoyed honestly and fairly by all.
In the annals of petty revenge, this tale finds its place in the chronicles of a middle school war between a power-hungry vice principal and a surly bus driver named Pat. It all started when young O.P., a well-behaved student, finally had the misfortune of crossing paths with these two authority figures during 8th grade. In the years prior, the school bus had been a sanctuary, thanks to a kind-hearted driver who let the kids put the windows down when the Georgia heat became unbearable. But as fate would have it, this beloved driver retired, leaving the students to the mercy of Pat, a woman whose anger seemed boundless, especially when it came to dealing with children. Pat, as grumpy as an irritated hornet, insisted that the windows remain up during the sweltering rides to school. Her claim was that it was to prevent students from tossing things out of the windows, though it had never been an issue before. The real reason, it seemed, was to save her the trouble of putting them all back up at the end of the day. OP's bus stop, once the first pass-by and the last to pick up, became the target of Pat's irrational desire to minimize stops. She repeatedly threatened to leave the neighborhood kids stranded if they forced her to stop twice. The conflict between OP and Pat escalated one morning when she left him stranded on a busy road, a cruel gesture that went unpunished. A misunderstanding with fellow students made Pat believe OP had flipped her off, although he was actually reacting to the mockery from other kids. After that incident, Pat and the vice principal, known as Karen, developed an obsession with getting OP into trouble. Pat even tried to coach a student into falsely accusing him of bullying, but the plan backfired when the young accuser defended OP as a friend, not a bully. This is where the petty revenge comes into play. OP began a campaign of passive-aggressive resistance, poking at Pat's easily irritable nature in subtle ways. While Pat was easy to annoy, Karen proved to be a more challenging target. However, karma has a way of catching up to those who deserve it. One day, OP's mother decided it was time to give Karen a taste of her own medicine. She heard about a police fundraiser that involved mock arrests for charity. If someone nominated a person for arrest, the police would handcuff them and hold them until they raised bail money for charity. OP's mother seized the opportunity and nominated Karen for the mock arrest. The police arrived at the school, handcuffed Karen, and escorted her to a room where she could make calls to raise the money for her bail. The plan was to keep her arrested for as long as possible. However, there was one significant hitch in Karen's plan. No one was willing to contribute a dime to bail her out, even for charity. Teachers, staff, and even her friends refused to help. Karen sat in the police precinct, increasingly frustrated as hours ticked by with no sign of a bailout. Eventually, the police, realizing it had gone on long enough, released Karen, as she was the only one who couldn't raise the bail money. It was a lesson in humility and a bitter taste of the esteem in which she was held by her colleagues and friends. OP's mother asked Karen with a sly grin, "How was jail?" before they walked away for the last time. It may have been a minor and petty act, but the satisfaction it brought was immeasurable. And so, in the world of middle school revenge, this small victory still rings with sweet justice, proving that sometimes, even the most minor acts of retribution can leave the loudest impact.
Around 2 decades ago, I was a Navy pilot embarking on my maiden deployment, tasked with flying helicopters from a destroyer. Our small flotilla in the Mediterranean Sea was under the command of a Commodore named Chuck, whom I can only describe as a complete jerk. Allow me to share 2 instances that capture his exceptional level of assholery. One sunny day, after a morning of flying, we received orders to pick up Commodore Chuck from one ship and transport him to our own. Simple enough, or so we thought. It was lunchtime, and our stomachs were growling with hunger. Usually, ships provide box lunches to flight crews landing around meal times, so we requested lunch. As we touched down, Chuck made us wait for half an hour without shutting down before he finally boarded our chopper. During this wait, someone delivered 4 styrofoam boxes filled with pizza. Jackpot. These boxes appeared without any explanation, and nobody bothered to connect them to the communications system. They were just placed in the cabin and left there. So, we completed our mission, flying Chuck and his staff to our ship, shutting down the helicopter, and unloading everything. The crewmen wasted no time in devouring the pizza, while the other pilot attended to paperwork, and I tended to the engines. After I'd finished my engine duties, our officer in charge, OIC, our boss, approached me and inquired about the pizza's fate. I confess that I believed the crew had eaten most of it as I hadn't had a chance to partake. To my dismay, it turned out that the pizza was intended solely for Chuck, who was now furious. He berated our OIC for encouraging theft among his men, subjecting him to a full-blown, stand-at-attention dressing down. We attempted to explain and apologize, but our efforts fell on deaf ears. Chuck was inconsolable. So, the next time we flew into Suda Bay, we ordered an actual pizza from a local pizzeria and delivered it to him, but he didn't even say thank you. Now, let's move on to the next instance of Chuck's infuriating behavior. Before embarking on this cruise, I had placed an order for a Nissan 350Z, the first model year for this sports car in 2003. However, this was in early 2002. One day after our deployment, I received a call from the Nissan dealership informing me that they had received a shipment of 350Zs. While none of them matched my order specs exactly, they invited me to check if any would be acceptable for immediate purchase instead of waiting. Eager to see what they had, I headed to the dealership. The sales rep I'd been in contact with met me and showed me a car on the showroom floor that closely resembled my order, except for the color. I had requested silver, but this one was maroon, though everything else matched. As I perused the vehicle, I noticed someone else showing great interest in it, Chuck. I doubted he recognized me. After all, I was a relative peon compared to his lofty position, and I was dressed in civilian clothes. "Nice car," I remarked to Chuck. "Yeah, this is a beauty," he replied with enthusiasm. "It's exactly what I want. I'm going to buy this one." I nodded thoughtfully and then signaled my sales guy over. "I'll take it." "Let's go sign the papers," I declared, putting on a friendly smile. I derived immense satisfaction from the look of stunned disbelief on Chuck's face as the salesman promptly placed a little sold sign under the windshield wiper, and I proceeded with the transaction. It might have been a petty move, but it felt incredibly satisfying. "Screw you, Chuck."